I want to convince you that it's possible that Vikings might have worn horned helmets.
What is he doing?
Oh.
That sentence alone will probably make some people very angry. Because everywhere I look, videos, articles, academic papers, documentaries, CNN segments, comment threads, forums, people are falling over themselves to say Vikings never wore horned helmets. It has become a meme, a smug, unkillable meme. The actually crowd has worked overtime to make sure no one can ever consider this idea anymore. Bringing up Viking armor in any context will inevitably lead to someone leaping out of the digital bushes to sneer, "Did you know Vikings didn't have horns on their helmets?" It is such a well-rehearsed correction that even well-read historians and serious arms and armor enthusiasts will sometimes take it one step further and mock the very idea that any culture ever, throughout history, put horns on a helmet, as if the very concept is absurd, as if the only people who ever believed sticking horns on a helmet would be cartoonists and fools. But that's completely wrong. You might be thinking, well, okay, maybe some people are overzealous about correcting this, but isn't it true that Vikings never wore horned helmets? And to that, I say, no, it is not true that Vikings never wore horned helmets, because we don't know that. We don't know that for a fact. What we do know for a fact, what is certain about Viking helmets, about Viking arms and armor generally, is shockingly limited. We are piecing together fragments of a much, much larger picture that, frankly, we pretty much do not have. We know very little about Viking arms and armor. So the claim that Vikings never, definitively never, wore horned helmets isn't based on some irrefutable evidence, or really any evidence at all. It's based on a lack of evidence. It's based on assumption, consensus, and vibes. Because the real verifiable truth is this. We have no solid evidence that they didn't wear horned helmets, and in fact, we actually have some pretty compelling evidence that they might have actually worn horned helmets, at least ceremonially. We'll talk about that evidence in a moment, but here's the bigger issue at hand. This is not about Viking helmets. It is about dogma, it's about pedantry, and the idea that if enough people repeat something loudly enough, if enough YouTube videos and Reddit chain comments and articles are written, that thing becomes the truth. Truth is not a popularity contest. It is not the property of credentialed experts. It is not created by peer review. Truth is about evidence, and the absence of evidence is not the same thing as a proof of absence. When it comes to Viking helmets, this is especially important because most amateur historians ranting about how Vikings never wore horned helmets probably don't realize just how little actual archaeological evidence has been found for what Viking helmets look like. The evidence is minuscule. There is literally only one verifiable, complete Viking helmet that has ever been found. There are maybe 5 or 6 more incomplete helmets and one that might be a Viking helmet, but the rest of them are either fragmentary, broken bits and corroded pieces that we assume are parts of helmets, or is a helmet that may not be a Viking helmet. That's it. So we're talking about maybe 6 items total, 5 of which are deeply incomplete. That is our entire data set for what we are determining a Viking helmet is and isn't. So the physical evidence that Vikings even wore helmets at all is pretty scarce. And even worse, all or nearly all of those helmet finds come from elite burials, the burials of high-ranking members of society, noblemen, which means they are not representative of the average Viking. They are likely the exception, they are survivals, they are probably not the rule, and therefore not representative. Yet despite this, we have modern artistic reconstructions, we have these actually Reddit posts and articles passionately correcting people for depicting Vikings with horned helmets as if we have some definitive understanding of what Viking headgear looks like. We do not even close. From a statistical standpoint, the data set we have is basically useless. Archaeologists have found helmets or helmet fragments in fewer than 0.1% of Viking burials. That is far too small to draw any meaningful conclusions about. In statistics, the sample size determines the strength of your conclusion, specifically the sample size in comparison to the population size. So if, for example, you want to study Greek helmets, of which over 1,000 examples survive to the modern day, you can draw from dozens or hundreds of these helmets to create a statistically grounded inference drawn from a large sample. That is fairly valid, mathematically speaking. In contrast, Viking helmet evidence does not even meet the rule of 30. There are, like I said, only about 6 quote-unquote helmets, 5 of which are basically just chunks of helmet. So the standard baseline, the rule of 30, which we use as the minimum for making basic statistical inferences, is not even close to achievable. If we assume that the population size, so the total number, let's say, of all existing Viking helmets historically was about 1,000, which I think is a very conservative estimate, then the fact that we can't even reach a sample size of under 30 means that any inference we make is mathematically and therefore truth-wise worthless. It is too small to make any reliable distribution. We cannot say anything conclusive about Viking helmets from a physical evidence point of view because our sample size is less than 1% of the assumed population if we take a very conservative estimate, and well under, as I said, the statistical minimum threshold for meaningful analysis. So yes, we don't have archaeological evidence that Vikings have horned helmets yet, but the truth is we also have, like I said, very little physical evidence of what Vikings wore on their heads at all. And that is the part people are constantly skipping in the rush to post comments or articles, saying Vikings did not wear horns on their helmets. It is a myth. It's not so much a myth as speculation, and maybe not so good speculation, or actually maybe speculation that's not as bad as one might assume. Because physical evidence is not the end-all be-all of history. Just because we've almost never found physical Viking helmets doesn't mean they never wore them. There are plenty of depictions of Vikings wearing helmets carved on runestones and left in other pieces of art we'll talk about more in a minute. We also know the direct predecessors, the Vendel culture and other Germanic cultures nearby, definitely wore helmets, and elaborate ones at that. We also know basically all the contemporaries of the Vikings did. Many of the Vikings' direct successors, such as the Normans, wore helmets. So unless Vikings were somehow uniquely disinterested in head protection, it's pretty reasonable to assume that they did wear helmets, probably pretty regularly. The head is an important part of the body to protect. We also have a tiny handful of literary references that imply that Vikings did wear helmets regularly in combat. In Heimskringla, written about 200 years after the events where it took place, King Haraldur is described as wearing a gilded helmet, so a very fancy helmet. That's it. That's the only reference to helmets in that entire saga. But in Egil's saga, arguably the more important saga, because it's actually rooted closely enough in Viking oral tradition to kind of be considered contemporary, there's a group of warriors described as, quote, taking their weapons and putting on their helmets and coats of mail as they're about to go to battle. That's the whole quote. Those two pieces of saga are the entire credible written history of Vikings wearing helmets. So it's nothing fancy, just a brief, yeah, we put on some helmets. There was a king wearing a helmet. There are a handful of other literary descriptions from outside sources. I think there's an Irish saga where they talk about Vikings having helmets on. But the descriptions are extremely brief. There's no mention of ornamentation of any kind, decoration of any kind, just helmets mentioned in passing. The Vikings themselves never mention, as far as we are aware, their armor to much degree. So the written evidence is thin, the archaeological evidence is thinner, but it is still reasonable to assume that helmets were used. And there are no accounts that say Vikings did not wear helmets, or that they were unusually unprotected in battle. So we can assume that they probably did wear helmets, but from the archaeological evidence, we cannot draw any conclusion about what those helmets really would have been like. So we have to touch on one other piece of evidence in reviewing history, which is art. So there's physical evidence, there's written evidence, and then there's the art of Vikings. People who drew Vikings, people who drew depictions of them. So of that contemporary visual art of the Vikings, there is a peculiarity in that there are no known artworks from other cultures that definitively depict Viking warriors during their time period. There's no contemporary art that is a Viking that is not drawn by people of that culture, of the Norse Viking culture. Zero. At best, we have things like the Bayeux Tapestry, but this depicts Normans who had been fully assimilated into Frankish culture, probably for more than a century, 100 years when the tapestry was created, so their armor, horses, and tactics are probably much more reflective of their continental surroundings than anything like their Scandinavian roots. So that leaves us with Viking art itself. The Vikings did actually draw some pictures of themselves wearing arms and armor. That is the only source we have for what Viking warriors probably looked like. There are a few artistic examples before, during, and after the Viking Age that show Norse warriors and Viking warriors, and many of these show horned or elaborate headgear on these warriors. Now, this headgear may not be battlefield helmets, it's probably not battlefield helmets, but they do imply that horned helmets were a real cultural concept, probably used in ritual, symbolism, or ceremony. The most compelling single example of this is the Oseberg tapestry. So it was found in a ship burial, the famous ship burial of Oseberg, from about 834 AD in Norway. And there's a tapestry that was found in this burial that shows a procession of warriors, horses, and carts. It might be a funerary procession, it may be a number of ceremonies, but one of the figures in this tapestry clearly appears to be wearing a horned helmet. Not just some kind of possibly crested headgear, but a helmet with definitive horns on it. Unlike the other figures in the drawing, he carries a sword rather than a spear, which suggests some kind of elite status to this person. Perhaps they are a religious figure, perhaps it may be a representation of a god, but there is also, on the Oseberg tablet, a second figure, also wearing armor, also with horn-like headgear. The depiction in the Oseberg tapestry is very controversial. There are many scholars who argue maybe that is actually just a drawing of Odin, maybe the horns are symbolic, maybe it's not even a helmet, maybe it's part of his head. But all of those, I think, are obviously speculations, and they are speculations layered on top of what is, at the end of the day, a very plain image. A warrior wearing armor, carrying a sword, wearing a helmet with horns. That is a Viking depiction of a Viking warrior. And here's what makes it more compelling. Other items are depicted in this tapestry, aside from the horned helmet guy. There are also some ornate carts, and many of these items were found physically in the burial itself, which strongly implies this tapestry depicted a real event or real things. These ornate carts are real. Many of the other objects are real things. These are not fantasy images. They were probably part of the same funerary context, the same funerary procession, which strongly implies there was, at least in a funeral rite, a guy who wears a horned helmet in the Viking Age. The tapestry shows real horses, real people, real wagons, real weapons, and a horned helmet, so why would we believe every other item on that tapestry reflects something real except the helmet? There is no real logical argument to be made for that except to support a bias that horned helmets did not exist. So I think if a reenactor showed up wearing a horned helmet vaguely like the one depicted here, for non-combat reenactment purposes, I don't think that should be considered grossly ahistorical. There is a depiction of it. There is art of it. The fact that there's a tapestry clearly showing a warrior wearing this kind of helmet might even make it acceptable for combat reenactment. There are plenty of Viking reenactors and LARPers who wear helmets that never appear in any tapestries or never appear in any archaeological finds, and there are plenty of LARPers and Viking reenactors who wear lamellar armor. And lamellar armor has some very scant evidence supporting that Vikings ever wore it. Although, if you look closely at the Oseberg tapestry, some of the armor, to my opinion, does look a little like lamellar. Regardless, while the tapestry does not prove Vikings wore horned helmets into battle, it definitely shows that they conceived of warriors, or at least one high-status warrior, wearing them, even if just in a symbolic circumstance. And unless we have a specific reason to exclude that detail from reality, it is not unreasonable to think maybe some helmets had horns, at least ceremonially, and possibly even in maybe limited combat situations, like on a raid. Additionally, even if the tapestry is depicting Odin, as many people often say it is depicting a warrior Odin wielding a sword, hauberk, and horned helmet, which still supports the view that horned helmets were some part of the Viking cultural zeitgeist. Furthermore, it is worth pointing out that the Oseberg tapestry is not an outlier in the sense that there are other Viking tapestries of warriors that don't have horns on them. It is an outlier because it's the only surviving Viking tapestry that depicts warriors at all. There are literally no other Viking-era tapestries that survive that clearly show people, let alone armed figures. The total number of surviving Viking tapestries that depict warriors is exactly 1. And it's this one. It's the Oseberg tapestry. There are maybe a half a dozen other Viking textile recoveries in general, all of which are mostly fragmentary, bits of clothing, decorative bands, some patterns. I think there's one that shows silhouettes on a boat. So, the only Viking tapestry we have that shows warriors depicts 2 of them wearing horned helmets. So if we're comfortable basing assumptions on what the Normans wore on the Bayeux Tapestry, which is considered the primary source for what we believe Norman armor and arms look like, then I think it is equally fair to consider the Oseberg Tapestry as meaningful evidence for what Norwegian Vikings might have worn, especially their elites, at least in ceremonies. Because there is a critical difference between the Oseberg Tapestry and the Bayeux Tapestry. The Oseberg Tapestry does not seem to depict a battle. It seems to depict a ceremony. There is, however, an especially great irony here, because the primary argument I hear against horned helmets hinges on the fact that only 1 or 2 Viking helmets have been found, and none of them have been found with horns, as if that somehow closes the case. Meanwhile, the single surviving tapestry from the Viking era, the entire surviving corpus of Viking-era tapestry art, shows the opposite. It shows warriors with horned helmets. So on the one hand, we have a scant amount of evidence that doesn't show horned helmets, and on the other hand, we have a scant amount of evidence showing horned helmets. And I think it's worth underscoring this, even if it belabors the point, that not finding horns on 2 or 3 helmets is not strong evidence that Vikings never wore horned helmets, because it's negative evidence. It just means we haven't found any. It doesn't prove they didn't exist. By contrast, a tapestry that shows a warrior wearing a horned helmet is evidence that such helmets may have existed. It is positive evidence, and that difference matters. It's very significant. When you go looking for something and you don't find it, all you have proven is that you did not find it. That should be taken at face value, not inflated to make blanket conclusions and debunk quote-unquote myths. So, beyond the Oseberg tapestry, there are actually also a few other pieces of artistic evidence that offer some supplementary support. We have much stronger evidence right before and after the Viking periods. So, for example, during the migration and Vendel periods, which preceded the Viking Age, those centuries leading up to it, and the centuries just after it, we have between 15 or 20 nearly complete helmets. While none of those helmets have horns, some of them themselves depict figures wearing horned helmets, engraved or stamped right onto the helmet decoration. So, again, no evidence of Viking horned helmets or their predecessors wearing horned helmets in the archaeological record, but in the archaeological record, there are artistic depictions of horned helmeted figures. So the idea exists in the visual vocabulary, even if it doesn't manifest in real wearable gear. Specifically, the Volsgarde 5, 6, 7, and 8 helmets all have these decorative foil panels, some of which depict warriors wearing helmets with horn-like or crest-like extensions. Decorative foils like this have been found also on their own. There were a few from Öland in Sweden, known as the Torslunda plates. And one of these plates famously shows a warrior wearing a horned or laterally crested helmet, armed with a spear, well, 2 spears, and a sword. The Torslunda plate is especially compelling because it clearly shows a warrior figure, not a deity or mythical creature as far as we can tell. He's carrying weapons, he's wearing a helmet, he's standing beside a wolfskin-clad berserker, which is another warrior archetype from the era. Some people argue that this horned figure must be Odin, because one eye of his appears to be missing, but laser analysis of the plate has revealed that this is probably just wear and tear over time, not an intentional change. So the Odin hypothesis is pretty speculative at best. Another reason to doubt the Odin interpretation is because nearly the same figure appears on other art and other artifacts. Specifically, several versions of this figure appear on the Sutton helmet, which is a very famous Anglo-Saxon royal artifact. In that case, there are 2 horn-crested warriors crossing swords, almost exactly the same figure. So if the horned figure is Odin, why is there 2 of him? Is the second guy also Odin? That doesn't really make sense. It's more plausible that these horned helmeted warriors are symbolic representations of elite martial power, not literal gods. They may also be representations of a symbolic sword dance that is theorized to have been a thing. But the fact that we see this horned sword dancer standing next to a berserker implies both are warriors, even if the horned helmet is just a symbolic thing that he may not actually wear into real combat. So these may not be perfectly realistic battlefield depictions, but they do show that horned helmets were a part of the visual culture of Norse and Germanic warrior identity, and important enough to appear on actual helmets and on the helmets of quite wealthy people. There's also the Finglesham buckle, or Finglesham buckle. I don't know how you pronounce that. It's an English name. And this is an Anglo-Saxon belt buckle from around the 600s, so just kind of prior to the Viking Age, found in England. And it shows a horned, helmeted warrior wielding 2 spears, so again, kind of similar to our sword dancer. And he is clearly wearing a nose-guarded helmet with horns, which really suggests this is a horned armor piece, not just a decorative hat or headdress. So now we're stretching across a couple centuries from the migration period to the end of the Viking Age and finding recurring horned warrior imagery in multiple mediums. This is clearly not a one-off, and it's not a 19th century fantasy. It is a real trope in Norse and Germanic culture. There are even Bronze and early age Scandinavian depictions of the same kind of horned warrior figure. And beyond depictions, there are actually a small number of real bronze horned helmets from the Scandinavian Bronze Age. These helmets are far too thin for combat use. They are almost certainly ceremonial, but they are real. They show that the idea of horned helmets existed in Scandinavia 1,000 years before the Viking Age. I don't think that sticking horns on a helmet is such a difficult concept that the Vikings would only draw it. I think they probably would have tried it themselves at some point for their ceremonies, if it indeed is a ceremonial thing. Many cultures, especially in the Bronze Age, produced horned helmets for rituals, for status people, for ceremonial power projection, which brings us back to one of the stranger effects of the whole Vikings never wore horned helmets, horned helmets debunked argument, which is that I've seen it create a kind of ripple effect that is so strong that now there are many people claiming that horned helmets never exist. They never existed anywhere, at all, at any time. And that's verifiably false, but it's now becoming a popular opinion. We have strong evidence that the Teutonic Knights, much more recently in history, wore horned helmets in duels and tournaments and even battle, and so did other medieval knights from that era. We know that the samurai kabuto were often adorned with horns. There are many of these surviving helmets still around. They had antlers, crests. One of them has like a giant shell. And these are used ceremonially, but also in combat across centuries of Japanese warfare. And yet somehow a modern bias has crept into arms and armor discourse, where modern conceptions of realism means that everyone's armor throughout the past has to conform to what we think looks practical today. There is this weird obsession with historical warriors behaving like game theory robots, where every piece of gear must optimize efficiency and nothing symbolic or irrational could ever be worn by anyone because that's ridiculous. It is a kind of cargo cult rationalism. It is a distorted version of Occam's razor we are seeing wielded by YouTubers and academics and others who dismiss anything that doesn't look modernly realistic to their eyes as being impossible. But ancient peoples did all kinds of things that we consider wildly impractical, and they did them all the time. The Romans used to sacrifice chickens before naval battles. The Aztecs built an entire imperial infrastructure, a vast system of flower wars and battles around ritual human sacrifice. And the Vikings, they had berserkers who probably took hallucinogens and are depicted as biting into their shields before charging at enemy formations. None of these are examples of the hyper-rational battlefield optimizations that warriors were supposed to have done if you listen to a lot of modern YouTubers. History is replete with people doing things that may seem irrational, theatrical, superstitious. This is because these people lived in a world that was infused with gods and omens and spirits and performance and casting runestones and carved bones into fires. So yes, I think it is entirely conceivable that some Viking warrior, high on ritual and pride, dressed up like the guy we see in the Oseberg tapestry, might have strapped horns to his helmet. Maybe to frighten his enemies, maybe to honor the gods, maybe because it just looked good. And I don't think that because we find it to be unreasonable that we should reject it out of hand entirely when their own art tells us a different story. And on the argument that horns are impractical in battle, which is something I hear lots of YouTubers talk about, you will hear this, that they are impractical for battle because, they give the enemy something to grab onto, like the enemy is going to reach up and grab your helmet. That's kind of a dumb argument. If you're close enough to grab your enemy's helmet horns, you are close enough to stab him in the throat. No one wastes a strike trying to hit decorative horns when they can just go for the kill. Most horns are also probably lightweight and detachable, like the actual horns we see on Japanese helmets, or the crests we see on medieval European helmets. So trying to hit them would probably just knock them off and would waste both of your time and the enemy's time. There's another claim I hear often that horns don't work because you're in formation fighting. But this is also a poor argument because most fighting is not done in formation. Vikings very rarely fight in rigid blocks. To be a Viking is to be a raider. They raid. They ambush. They do hit and run attacks on monasteries. Most Viking warfare is not about shield walls. It is about showing up fast, hitting hard, and getting out. Running away with all of the stuff you stole from those priests. So yes, horns are probably not great for fighting in formation. They may reduce your mobility slightly, but they make you look cool. And warriors throughout history, we know this, have routinely sacrificed practicality for aesthetic, for rank, for mysticism, for appearance, to frighten their enemies. In the Boxer Rebellion, some Chinese fighters refused to use guns and wore no armor, oftentimes were bare-chested, because they believed martial arts would make them bulletproof. there are Aztec eagle and jaguar warriors who wore these ornate, highly decorated headdresses and outfits with feathers and plumes and bright colors and all of this extra stuff. And they did it not just to look good, but to communicate their identity and to terrify their enemies. And there are accounts from Spaniards describing how terrifying these Aztec warriors looked. So clearly it did have some impact. So the idea that some Viking chieftain or noble might have worn a horned helmet during a raid is not just possible. I think it's possible. I think it's plausible. I mean, we can imagine a Viking warrior with a horned helmet riding at the front of his longship going towards a raid. Maybe he takes the helmet off, maybe not. But even in modern times, we often still wear impractical symbolic clothing to mark occasion and identity. My grandfather was a petroleum geologist, and he wore a three-piece suit to work nearly every day until he died. And again, he was a petroleum geologist. That is not a practical uniform. He would take it off at home when he was doing some work, or, when he went out in the field, sometimes he maybe would dress down. But when he went out, he wore that uniform because it meant something to him and to other people. I myself have dressed up in nice clothes for events where I immediately take the clothes off afterward. I'm sure a lot of women can relate to the idea of wearing very impractical shoes because they look good. And how you look when you arrive somewhere or participate in an event matters, not just to others, but also to yourself, to your own identity. So again, imagining a Viking nobleman on a ship sailing toward a raid with his horned helmet on, maybe this is something that marks him out as a leader, as a warrior, as a shaman, maybe as something otherworldly. Maybe he swaps this out for something more practical when he hits the land, or if he's expecting a real shield wall style battle, or maybe he doesn't. Maybe he storms to the beach in his full regalia, horns and all, terrifying whoever stands in his way. Because a lot of the times the people standing in his way are monks, and it's not really a big deal if your helmet isn't 100% combat optimized when you're fighting a 67-year-old dude named, Ethelbart. So warfare is, in the past, very much about theater as much as it is about violence. Think about how the Romans went to war with great big banners and, a guy carrying the standard of a legion and huge plumes on helmets. And there are cases where centurions wore special outfits to demonstrate that they had some wealth and power. After the Viking Age, Scandinavians, we know, identify increasingly with the continent, and they increasingly adopt these continental military styles. So that's heavier mail, kite shields, mounted tactics. But even then, we can still find some remnants of this kind of symbolic warrior dress that, it comes from the Viking Age, perhaps. For example, we take the Skog tapestry from Sweden, which comes from a church made shortly after the Viking Age. It shows Scandinavian warriors wearing helmets with horn-like or antler-like projections. If such a tradition of horns on helmets existed, whether in art or in reality, the tradition was a long-lasting enough one that it maybe stuck around and didn't disappear for some centuries, which I think implies that horns on helmets may be more common than we might even think. But once again, this is a tapestry that has a lot of controversy around it. There are many people who interpret the three figures on here as symbolic, as perhaps an early depiction of the Christian Trinity, perhaps representing the Norse gods who were still halfway worshipped or being phased out. But setting those speculations and symbolism aside, we can look at what we actually see here, and they appear quite plainly to be three warriors, each with a helmet that has a nose guard or spectacles, and in the case of the leftmost figure, he's carrying a Dane axe, which is clearly a warrior's weapon. To my eyes, all three also are clearly wearing helmets that have some kind of horn or antler attachment, horn-like projections. I'll let you decide what you see. But given that there's at least some evidence that Vikings wore or at least imagined themselves wearing horned helmets, whether it's for ceremony or in limited battlefield roles, why is there such a strong movement today to ridicule this idea entirely? And And I think the backlash is not baseless, obviously. I think there's big reasons for it. For over a century now, we've had popular media, films, television, comics, books that have depicted Vikings in a very outlandish way with big horned helmets and beards and wings and all this other stuff, which has very little, if no, grounds in archaeological reality. Those tropes trace back not to the Viking sources, as many people are often pointing out, but to the 19th century Romantic revival of Norse mythology. The revival reached its kind of visual and theatrical peak with the operas of Wagner, which portrays these mythic Germanic heroes wearing fantastical horned helmets, drawing on this romantic art, and that filtered into comics and cartoons like Looney Tunes and parody characters like Hagar the Horrible. But the important part to take from all of that is that those 19th century Viking revival art pieces, while they are pretty unrealistic, they didn't come from nothing. They were built on a wave of real archaeological discoveries happening in the 1800s and the early 1900s, including the tapestry I mentioned earlier, the Oseberg tapestry, including real helmets, including real pieces like the Torsvold plates that show depictions with horned or crested warrior figures. There is even a Roman historian who talks about Celtic barbarians having horned helmets. And so these kind of thoughts of, barbarians from the north with horned helmets is around in the cultural feelings of the time, and it filters into the art. What happened next was this kind of cultural overgrowth. We had artists and nationalists and opera designers taking liberties. They are exaggerating these motifs. They're combining real artifacts with their romanticized myth of, gods and legends. And they create this distorted version of Nordic history, of Norse history, with our images of honored, muscle-bound theatrical warriors that no longer match the archaeological record. And by the late 20th and early 21st century, the modern era, that distortion had gone so far that a new movement then emerges in response, which is this movement of overcorrection, the actually movement. And now we have all these scholars and enthusiasts rushing to debunk the horned Viking helmets, and they do it with such a force that they end up denying or ignoring actual archaeological historical evidence in the process. And things like the Oseberg tapestry get almost written out and put aside and derided, and people make up all kinds of excuses to try and say that's not a horned helmet. And that's the problem. The truth is we do not know much of anything for certain about whether Vikings ever wore horned helmets in battle. But we do know that they imagined warrior figures that did. We know that they created art that shows horned helmeted figures, maybe warriors, maybe gods, maybe people doing ceremonial dances, maybe both. And we know that other cultures, plenty of other cultures, Teutonic Knights, samurai, Aztecs, wore impractical, symbolic, and even horned helmets into battle. And we know that history is full of people doing things not because they were of utmost military practicality, but because they felt this might have been reasonable or meaningful or symbolic to them in their culture, in their context. So yes, I think it is plausible that some Viking somewhere wore a horned helmet in a ritual, in a funeral, on a ship, or maybe even on a raid. And I think it probably happened a lot more than once. And I think you should believe that is possible and plausible too. So the next time you see someone draw a Viking figure with a horned helmet or dress up as a Viking with big horns or wings on his head for Halloween, maybe don't be so quick to judge.